Hi everyone, in recent videos I've been talking about how the world changes over time in terms of its general development through the ages, and now it seems that we pass through another phase, as we can see from Putin's Tucker Carlson interview, after recently saying the rest of his presidency would be about protecting Russia's sovereignty. And so the question is how we're going to solve the problem of this phase. This video shows how it will be done by creating a shift to a more objective perspective, which will become characteristic of the Anthropocene, from the technical problem that we've got now of solving the problem that we're having at the moment, which is a lot to do with the Ukraine war. So, because the question is really, what can the response from the West possibly be? It's such an absurd position to be in, because Ukraine was part of the EU, so of course they were going to try and defend it. But for the people of the West, the plan to defend Ukraine has largely backfired, with the dollar losing its advantage. So where are we now? We can see the postmodern age has been through several phases. The question is, what are the proportions of this phase in relation to the others? We can see the onset of the Cold War in 1946 as the first part. The second part was the gradual resolving of the capitalist-communist issue following the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962, as the Mutually Assured Destruction Treaty was signed. The third then would be the way the situation led to the end of the Cold War, and this happened as Soviet communism had run its course, gradually letting in Western capitalism, thus leading to the fourth phase of the post-Cold War period, which was around 1990 to 2001. We still had an issue between the two sides, while the West kept expanding NATO, and what we formerly knew as the Eastern Bloc became the BRICS alliance of Russia, Brazil, India, China, and South Africa. So here we can see the start of the Anthropocene appearing, as we now have a world order capable of sustaining the idea. However, problems caused by the Cold War still existed, and the Middle East polarized between conservative Saudi Arabia and revolutionary Iran, causing a series of uprisings known as the Arab Spring, and finishing with the war zones which merged in Iraq and Syria, known as the Arab Winter. It also involved the 9/11 attack on New York, as some people in the Middle East saw the only solution was to get the Western powers, which had obviously led to capitalism as the Europeans took over the Americas, and then the antithesis of that in communism actually being the cause of the polarization of the Middle East, which after the war on terror, the UN found a solution in creating the multipolar political environment, which placed more responsibility on all nations for global security and the well-being of citizens. So as we can see there, that the solution doesn't entirely fit the problem, but it's all about the way the world moves forward in phases, really, and how we're going to solve the problem of the last phase and move the world forward. So having established this, then, what happens is that we enter a phase when this is more's been revealed, more's been people can see more about the way the world works, and we're constantly moving into a more open environment. So we enter a phase when the differences between nations becomes more of a technical issue. There is a mix of capitalism and communist influence across the world, so it's not about that anymore. And we've moved forward another phase from having resolved that issue. So what we could call logically a sixth phase appears, whereby there's a renegotiation of capitalist-communist relations involving North Korea, China, and the Trump administration of 2016, as China became the top communist power. So we can see that we're now in the seventh wave as NATO's expanded, fundamentally to contain the rise of China in military terms. Bearing in mind the continued need to control the balance of power between NATO and BRICS, and thus we can see the prolonged aspect of the Ukraine-Russia conflict, as the West has tried to control the balance of power in its own way, while the BRICS side has tried to counterbalance that Western influence, and the technical difference is in reasoning on both sides, which has led to the war. So this is a significant factor when we look at how we're going to work out how to solve it. So what actually happened in Ukraine, I've already covered this, but there were a couple of things about the Russian reasoning and motives in the Tucker Carlson interview, which in my opinion have acted as significant information, as Putin explained quite rationally the historical relationship between Russia and Ukraine led to the war, because various reasons added up. Ukraine went independent in 2014, overthrowing its pro-Russian government and voting to join the EU, which he said the CIA spent $5 billion influencing, and this caused a small civil war between the pro-Russian separatists and the Ukraine government to appear in the eastern Donbass region bordering on Russia. So we knew this already, but what I didn't see before was how Russia had seen the whole situation developing, as the opening of borders for trade with Europe had closed borders with Russia, which would have had its markets flooded with Western products, and this caused a breakdown in diplomatic relations. So when there was talk of Ukraine joining NATO, Russia was deeply concerned that it would lose its port of Sevastopol in Crimea, which had been home to its Black Sea Fleet for 200 years and was a vital part of its global influence, as the Soviet Union had given Crimea to the Ukraine to administrate during the Cold War. So they didn't really feel that it actually belonged to them, and Russia took Crimea back in 2014 by annexing it, by taking control of its parliament, which then voted to join Russia, which was declared illegal by the UN. But then Ukraine then built a dam on the river supplying water to Crimea, causing a drought and a widespread famine to the population there. Henceforth, Russia had to build a $3 billion bridge to truck in bottled water, and eventually invaded in 2022 on the grounds that they were intervening in the civil war in the eastern Donbass region. One of the first things they did was to draw Ukrainian forces away from the Donbass region with an attack on Kiev, and one of the first things they did was to destroy the dam. However, massive help from the West, including money and arms, has meant a protracted ground war, which Putin criticised as making the conflict unnecessarily large, as he had no plans to push further into Europe, which was the picture being portrayed in the West. Despite sanctions then, he said, Russia was doing better through its trade with BRICS countries, which have been getting ahead of NATO in terms of GDP and purchasing power. In 1992, the G7 countries had 47% of GDP, or gross domestic product, or basically the amount of money that's produced worldwide. In 2022, it was just over 30%. So that's gone down a lot. And in 1992, BRICS had 16%, but in 2022, BRICS had the highest share of GDP, indicating that global equality has increased. And this ultimately lay behind the fundamental reasons why Russia felt justified in taking a long-term stance against the West. He also added that it was Boris Johnson, in fact, who had persuaded Ukraine to withdraw from the negotiations for peace, and specifically that Russia wanted to know why and to get back to it. But if we remember that the stuff going on in the background, Ukraine wanted some conditions and Russia wanted others, while the US and UK wanted to have a say in the structure of the situation which would emerge. Something not mentioned in the Carlson interview, though, was the Russian support for the Hamas attack on Israel, which conveniently diverted media attention away from the war in Ukraine and demonstrated there was a broader problem with the world order at large, which we can now see from the Israeli overreach in its war with Gaza. So as a phase, we can see that while the G7, the G20, and the multipolar environment have been pushed forward to the forefront of politics since the period involving the Cold War, we can see that we still have issues like this going on, as the superpowers are able to act autonomously owing to the UN Security Council, which was produced by the structure of the postmodern age. Earlier this winter, I talked to a retired lawyer, Andrew Higgs, who works for Russia and the United Arab Emirates, which is currently lobbying at the UN for marine vessel rights. He says, of reform to the Security Council, will it ever happen? Indicating that people in and around the situation at the UN are talking about the present situation in current terms and cannot look really beyond the existing system when it comes to achieving their aims through the political process.